In the heart of the raging storm, a torpedo suddenly ripped through the murky depths, slamming straight into the hull of a Russian destroyer. The violent explosion rocked the steel behemoth, sending the ship listing hard to one side. Dozens of sailors were thrown off their feet as seawater flooded the engine room. The power died. At first, many officers on the bridge mistook the jolt for a rogue wave, but as the hull fractured, steel plates buckling and black smoke pouring into the sky, the truth was undeniable. They'd been sucker punched. The scene was pure chaos. Sailors trapped below were dragged down with a sinking vessel. Life rafts, hastily deployed, bobbed violently on the savage waves, the air filled with the desperate cries of survivors. At the Russian Naval Command, the commander roared as he stared at the radar. A strange sonar contact was retreating back towards the American coast. He immediately ordered a red alert. Helicopters scrambled, sonar buoys were dropped, and the entire frigate fleet charged into the open sea. There was no doubt this was a covert attack launched by the United States. The Russian fleet was in disarray. Deep below, the American submarine moved in silence. The crew eyes glued to the sonar knew full well that dozens of depth charges were already being dropped, hunting them. They had succeeded in their opening shot, but one explosion too close, and the sub would be crushed by the immense pressure. And the American Command Center officers monitored the reports. The entire West Coast immediately shifted to a full defensive posture. Anti-ship Harpoon missile launchers were raised, coastal radar systems activated, and soldiers scrambled to their stations. Outside the glass, the storm still howled, but the heavy silence inside was far more terrifying. The Russian response was immediate. Missiles from land and sea streaked toward Naval Base San Diego. A fuel depot erupted in flames. Docks buckled and several military structures were destroyed. Moscow quickly issued a statement: America struck first. Our counterattack is justified. The message was repeated endlessly on state television, a thin veil for the painful blow they had just endured. America answered back instantly. A Harpoon anti-ship missile launched from the coast, tearing through the rain-swept sky toward an approaching Russian frigate. It was a direct hit. The warship belched black smoke as sailors leaped into the sea. Adrift and out of control, it fell out of formation. Inside the American Command Center, men jumped to their feet, slamming their hands on the consoles. The tension shattered, replaced by raw exhilaration. Coastal radar blared. The Russian fleet was expanding its attack. Multiple destroyer groups, frigates, and sub-hunting helicopters moved in unison. The storm limited visibility but couldn't stop the chase. The American sub used the seafloor terrain and the storm's acoustic noise to hide. Buoys, depth charges, and torpedoes rained down from the Russian side. Shockwaves rocked the deep. The sailors held on tight, cold sweat beating on their brows despite the frigid temperatures. On the American defense line, officers realized the extreme danger. Russia was clearly using the storm as cover for an all-out counteroffensive. And just then, newly deployed, previously classified systems came online. Mobile radar units were activated and electronic warfare systems fired up. Boring chalk Russian command signals dissolved into chaos. Seizing the disruption, the U.S. launched another volley of anti-ship missiles, striking a target closing on the coast. Another Russian ship was engulfed in flames, its surviving sailors jumping overboard even as an American launcher was obliterated by the preceding counterfire. Casualties mounted on both sides, neither would back down. The storm showed no sign of stopping, and the battle only grew more ferocious. At least 3 ships were already out of action, with dozens of sailors missing or wounded amidst the waves and smoke. The storm raged, but at the Russian military port, the red alert held. The command center was bathed in emergency lighting. Orders were shouted nonstop. The destroyer that had just sunk had become a festering wound, forcing Moscow to order immediate, overwhelming retaliation. Land-based missile batteries opened fire. Warheads dozens of feet long tore through the rain, screaming toward the American coastline. A barrage of explosions thundered against the gale. Warehouses, docks, and fuel depots at San Diego were hit. Fireballs rolled into the sky only to be torn apart by the wind. The storm degraded their accuracy, but the raw power was enough to shake the entire coastal defense line. It didn't stop there. From the harbor, a new wave of frigates and destroyers charged into the fray. Their hulls pitched violently and sailors clung to railings as waves crashed over the decks, but their orders were absolute. Get to sea, find the enemy sub. Sub-hunting helicopters were dispatched despite the wind shear. Their rotors wobbled, but they pressed on dropping sonar buoys into the black, churning water. The broadcast from Moscow repeated the line, America struck first. We are only defending ourselves. With no public evidence, it was just a tool to legitimize retaliation. Right now, the only thing that mattered was proving their strength remained intact, storm or no storm. On the other side of the strait, the American coast reeled from the first salvo. Naval Base San Diego was burning fiercely, where a missile had struck a fuel depot. The column of fire lit up the sky, the wind stretching the smoke into long black ribbons over the sea. Docks were obliterated. Several small patrol boats were tossed onto the shore, their hulls smashed by the wind and rain. Sailors and soldiers scattered for cover. The wounded were dragged into reinforced bunkers, but America's air and coastal defenses were not silent. Crews held their positions calmly. Though the storm jammed their radar, they identified the launch vectors and prepared to strike back. A Harpoon missile launcher angled up into the rain. The missile shot straight toward a Russian frigate that was pressing its attack. The impact registered clearly on radar. The missile tore into the frigate's side, shaking it violently. Smoke poured out as the ship listed. Sailors jumped, disappearing into the water. The storm capsized the life rafts, turning the evacuation into a nightmare. The battle devolved into a dangerous game of chess. Russia saturated the area with missiles and naval gunfire, trying to break the enemy's spirit. America responded with precise counterpunches, keeping the fleet from getting too close. Both sides took heavy losses, and the hurricane turned the battlefield into a chaotic hellscape. Through the downpour, wolf packs of sub-hunting helicopters relentlessly circled. Buoys were dropped, but the sonar returns were hopelessly muddied by the acoustic violence of the storm. Depth charges were dropped uselessly, sending up massive columns of water that the wind instantly erased. The American sub, like a ghost, vanished into the deep, leaving its hunters furious and empty-handed. At the American Command Center, reports flooded in, fuel depots, burning launchers damaged, but morale was holding. The remaining radar stations strained to track the Russian fleet as it edged closer. Meanwhile, the Russian commanders were far from satisfied. They had lost a frigate, several other ships were damaged, and the storm was wrecking their formation. Blaming America on TV might soothe public opinion, but the freezing sailors clinging to the decks of the lurching ships knew the truth. The enemy was not weak, and this storm was favoring whoever could use it. The waves still rose like moving walls. The wind whipped the surface into white foam. The first Russian salvo had turned San Diego into an inferno, but in the American command bunker, the order was given short and sharp counterattack. The remaining Harpoon batteries fired as one. Flames cut through the gray rain as the missiles streaked out. A massive explosion echoed back from the sea. The first missile had hit an advancing Russian frigate broadside. The ship shuttered its bow, erupting in fire, forcing sailors onto life rafts in the heaving seas. A few other missiles went wide, lost to the wind, but the effect was enough. The Russian formation was forced to pause. Russia's response was just as fast. Naval guns from the destroyers opened up, pouring shells onto the American coast. Explosions walked across the shoreline. A coastal missile launcher was blown apart, the fire spreading. Soldiers nearby were thrown to the ground, the wounded dragged back into the tunnels. The coast shook under the combined fury of the storm and the war. Even in this inferno, the morale of the American defenders never wavered. Crews rotated into position. Soldiers with patched-up wounds returned to their guns. They knew that if they broke, the line would collapse instantly. In the sky, Russian helicopters still circled, dropping buoys, desperate to find the American sub. But their radar and sonar were scrambled by the storm. The signals were patchy, mistaking underwater rock formations for contacts. Depth charges were dropped like rain, but they only churned the water. Deep below, the American sub quietly maneuvered, waiting for its next chance. The synergy between the remaining American radar and the Harpoon missiles continued to pay off. Another missile screamed out, this time hitting a Russian frigate directly in the engine room. The ship staggered, black smoke billowing out. The crew sent a frantic distress call, but in the storm, life rafts capsized as fast as they were launched and men vanished into the black water. But America paid the price too. A military warehouse was hit, triggering a massive secondary explosion. Firefighters and soldiers rushed into the storm to fight the blaze. Some never returned. Several radar stations were destroyed, making targeting much harder. The losses mounted, but the defense held. Both sides were bleeding. At sea, at least 2 Russian ships were out of the fight, others heavily damaged. On land, American facilities were wrecked with hundreds of casualties. But in the hurricane, neither side could land a knockout blow. The stalemate dragged on, every minute paid for in sweat and blood. The storm halpreed red-hot wreckage drifting on the waves. America and Russia were both exhausted, but neither would give an inch. The battle had become a contest of survival. The storm still raged, the rain so heavy it blurred the sky, the waves so high that even the Russian warships were struggling. In this chaos, the battle escalated. America had taken heavy losses from the Russian counter-barrage, but the line hadn't broken. And then the secret weapons prepared long in advance were brought into play. In a coastal bunker, American officers watched their radar screens, which had been flickering all morning. Suddenly, the signal clarified. A new type of mobile radar capable of constantly shifting frequencies to cut through the storm's interference was brought online. Simultaneously, an electronic warfare EW system was activated, and the Russian fleet's command and control network dissolved into static. These weren't standard issue assets. They were next-generation prototypes quietly integrated into the coastal defense network weeks ago. The storm hid their deployment from the world. Now secure satellite data streamed through encrypted channels, painting a crystal-clear picture of every Russian ship on the electronic map. The American officers looked at each other. No one said it, but they all understood a new invisible advantage was now in play. Immediately, the counteroffensive order was given. The Harpoon launchers adjusted their aim based on the new data. Through the whiteout, the missiles flew with terrifying accuracy. A Russian destroyer took 2 hits simultaneously. Fire and smoke erupted. The ship went dead in the water, losing contact with the fleet, forcing other ships to break formation to attempt a rescue. In the Russian command center, panic set in. "How are they so accurate in this storm?" an officer yelled. Their radar was failing. Communications were breaking up. Frigates drifted from their positions, unable to coordinate. Their numerical advantage was evaporating, replaced by confusion in the face of an enemy with superior technology. Below, the American sub used the chaos to close in. The storm provided natural cover. From a safe distance, another torpedo was launched. It struck a Russian frigate squarely amidships. The explosion tore the ship apart, forcing another emergency evacuation. At the same time, Russian helicopters tried to press the hunt, but the wind was too violent. One chopper struggling to maintain altitude was struck by a downdraft and slammed into the sea, disintegrating on impact. The entire crew was lost. The remaining aircraft were forced to pull back, leaving a fatal gap in the fleet's defenses. America didn't miss the opening. Another volley of missiles launched from the coast aimed directly at the gap in the Russian line. A destroyer burst into flames, the red glow reflecting off the rain-swept sea. The Russians tried to answer with long-range naval guns, but their shells fired without accurate targeting data went wide. They were losing control. Onshore, the American troops, though, exhausted, felt their morale surge. They watched the missiles arc into the storm, hearing reports of enemy ships being hit. The price was high, but the tide was turning. They were no longer just defending, they were fighting back. The hurricane hadn't let up. Waves crashed over the struggling ships, sweeping life rafts away. Both sides were in chaos, but Russia was clearly faltering. The commanders in Moscow had never planned for this. The storm hadn't crushed the Americans. It had become their allies shielding a counterattack guided by secret technology. The storm seemed to intensify the wind, tearing at everything not bolted down. But the naval battle exploded with renewed fury. The Russian fleet, having lost multiple ships, decided on an all-or-nothing assault. Destroyers and frigates formed a wide battle line, opening up with everything they had. A wall of shells and missiles tore across the range, slamming into the American coast. Bunkers shook, more launchers were destroyed, and earth and rock were thrown everywhere. It was a raw display of power meant to seize the initiative. America's reply was just as fierce. From the surviving bunkers, a swarm of Harpoon missiles took to the sky, their engines leaving bright trails in the gray murk. A Russian frigate was hit. The ship shuddered violently before fire erupted from its engine room. Sailors abandoned ship, many lost to the waves as their life rafts floundered. Deep below, the submarine duel reached its climax. Depth charges from Russian helicopters detonated in a terrifying chain, sending columns of water shooting toward the sky. But the American sub slipped through the net and fired another torpedo. It struck the tail of a Russian sub. The boat shook its control panels, flickering, forcing it to make an emergency surface to evacuate. The sight of their own submarine, vulnerable on the surface, added to the fleet's panic. The battle was just as brutal ashore. American coastal facilities were pounded. A warehouse exploded, black smoke mixing with the white rain. Soldiers rushed to pull their comrades from the rubble. Many were wounded, but refused to leave their posts, continuing to load the remaining launchers. The scene was a firefight in a hurricane. Missiles from both sides crossed paths. Many went astray, but those that hit turned warships into torches. The Russian fleet tried to win with sheer numbers, but the storm wrecked their accuracy. America, meanwhile, used its secret intelligence feed, making every shot count. That precision stunned the Russian officers, who couldn't understand how the U.S. was still landing kill shots. A Russian destroyer hit by 2 more missiles was now burning uncontrollably. The Russian line began to break apart as ships turned to shield the wounded vessel, exposing their own flanks. America was paying heavily too. At least 3 coastal launchers were completely gone. Logistics were a nightmare. Several small patrol boats had sunk their crews, clinging to wreckage. The wounded were pouring into field medics, where doctors worked by the faint glow of backup generators. Both sides were exhausted, but no one was stopping. The storm, the missiles, and the thunderclaps merged into one continuous roar. The battle had gone far beyond a simple border skirmish. It was a death match for national pride. When the latest reports hit Moscow, the generals grimaced. Losses were mounting and the enemy wasn't breaking. "If this continues, our losses will be unacceptable," one officer growled. But the order is to press the attack. On the other side, the Americans knew they were hurt, but they could also see the chaos in the Russian fleet. The balance was tipping, and the storm was siding with the patient. After reports of more crippled ships, Russian command made a final desperate move. They committed their reserves. 2 heavy cruisers and a nuclear-powered submarine were ordered to the battle. The logic was simple: crush the Americans with sheer mass, regardless of the weather. The massive ships plowed through the storm, their armored hulls indifferent to the waves, and entered the battle zone. But theory collapsed in the face of reality. Communications between the new ships and the battered fleet were intermittent. Orders from command were garbled. The heavy cruisers, sluggish in the massive waves, struggled to maneuver. Several times, the giant ships had to turn directly into the waves just to stay stable, completely breaking their combat formation. America seized the chance. The remaining Harpoon batteries fired at the gaps in the new formation. 2 missiles streaked through the range, slamming into a frigate that had been left exposed. The ship erupted in flames, the explosion echoing all the way to the shore. The Russian fleet faltered again. Below the Russian nuclear sub entered the fray a lumbering giant. It fired depth charges, the underwater concussions shaking the very seabed. The crew of the American sub held their breath. But the smaller, more nimble American sub slipped through the turbulence and in a stunning move fired a torpedo at a nearby frigate. It was a direct hit. The ship listed sailors scrambling to get off. The Russians tried to regain control with a massive barrage. Shells tore up the coastline, but just as they thought they'd found an opening, the American EW systems blinded their radar again. Their shells fell uselessly into the sea. American officers saw the weakness. Another volley of missiles guided by satellite data was launched. One struck the newly arrived heavy cruiser. Its thick armor saved it from sinking, but a massive fire broke out and the ship lost control. The fleet had to divert again to help shattering what little cohesion they had left. The constant, precise American attacks had thrown the Russians completely off balance. They had more ships, but they couldn't coordinate. The large ships became easy targets, while the smaller ones were lost in the storm. The American coast was a wreck. Ammo depots were hit, supply lines were cut, but the will to fight was unbroken. Soldiers stood guard in the soaking rain, hands on their triggers, waiting for the next order to fire. Reports back to Moscow were grim. Even with reinforcements, they were losing ships and failing to break the American line. A commander had to admit it: "We sent in more ships, but the storm is not on our side." That admission cut straight to the heart of the fleet's pride. In America, an officer watching the electronic map said it quietly: "They're exposing themselves. By throwing more ships into the chaos, Russia was only making more mistakes." And in that moment, the hurricane became the ultimate ally of the resilient. The tide had turned. America was not just surviving, it was winning. The hurricane still screamed rain sheeting down, but something even more dangerous was at work: the American electronic warfare systems. Antennas that had been dormant were now transmitting at full power. And the Russian fleet's command center, the radar screens dissolved into pure static. Contacts appeared and vanished. Friend and foe were indistinguishable. Officers pounded on their keyboards, but the screens remained a meaningless swirl. A commander slammed his fist on the table. "We're blind." While Russia was blinded, the American command center received crystal clear satellite data. They identified their primary target, the Russian command destroyer, desperately trying to rally its ships. A full salvo of Harpoon missiles launched. Guided by perfect coordinates, they flew true. The first missile hit amidships, the second hit the engine room. The ship convulsed, a fireball erupted, and the vessel listed hard. The command ship went completely dark. The Russian fleet was a snake with its head cut off. Communications collapsed, orders vanished, units were on their own, some ships fired wildly into the storm. One frigate nearly fired on a friendly destroyer in the confusion. America exploited the collapse. Mobile launchers were moved to the shoreline, firing another volley at the remaining large destroyers. One was hit, and its crew was forced to abandon ship into the storm-tossed sea. Russian helicopters tried to regain control, but they were flying blind in the gale. One flew too low and was clipped by a wave, cartwheeling into the ocean and disintegrating. The rest were forced to retreat. The American sub, now operating with impunity as the enemy's sonar was jammed, fired again. A torpedo struck a frigate that was trying to protect the flagship. The explosion was another nail in the coffin of the Russian fleet's morale. Reports to Moscow were now catastrophic. Losses were accelerating. Radar was dead. "This isn't just a storm," a general muttered. "Someone is interfering." No one dared say it was American technology they had tragically underestimated. In America, the commanders were silent about their data source. They just told their troops, "This is our chance, take it." And the missiles kept flying as if the storm didn't exist. An officer watched another red icon vanish from the map and clenched his fist. We're winning. The battle had reversed. Russia's superior numbers were now a liability. America, from a desperate defense, was now actively hunting. The technological gap exploited by the invisible hand of American innovation had shattered the supposedly invincible fleet. The storm didn't let up. The wind was so strong it literally tore life rafts apart. In this chaos, the killing blow was delivered. From the deep, the American sub fired its last torpedo. It ran true, striking the Russian command ship that was already crippled. The explosion tore the massive vessel in two. Smoke and fire erupted as the ship buckled its steel frame, groaning before it slipped beneath the waves. The loss of the flagship shattered the Russian fleet. On other ships, sailors just watched the pillar of smoke vanish. There were no more orders. Frigates floundered, unsure whether to rescue survivors or flee. An officer screamed into a dead radio, "No orders, we're on our own." America seized the moment. The command was given general counterattack. Every remaining launcher fired. A Russian destroyer took 2 direct hits, its hull splitting open fire, pouring from its engine room as sailors leaped into the sea. The American defenders, exhausted for hours, felt a surge of adrenaline. Coastal artillery opened up, pounding the Russian ships that were now wallowing in the waves. The Russian fleet was in a death spiral. Ships tried to send distress calls, but the EW jamming was relentless. Some ships collided in the panic. The nuclear sub designed for the open ocean was struggling badly in the coastal turbulence, its sonar useless. The American sub, a ghost, slipped away. The remaining Russian helicopters couldn't change a thing and were forced to pull back. Without air cover, the fleet was naked. American satellite data continued to feed targets. Another missile hit a heavy cruiser. The fire was catastrophic. Onshore American forces had taken grievous losses, but their spirit was unbroken. When they got the news the enemy flagship was sunk, a cheer went up from the bunkers. The reports to Moscow were now unthinkable. The flagship was gone. Multiple ships were sunk. The fleet was blind and deaf. A general stated the cold, hard truth: the storm didn't beat them. The storm beat us. The weather was unchanged, but the battle was over. Russia was no longer attacking. It was trying to survive. America, the small island of defiance against a massive fleet, had held, and by using its hidden strength had broken its enemy. The world was watching. The balance of power was shifting in the middle of a hurricane. The storm still screamed the waves higher than a ship's mast. The Russian fleet was a broken mob. The flagship was gone. Destroyers and frigates were burning their smoke, mixing with the sea spray. The Russian confidence was gone, replaced by pure panic. America didn't let up. The Harpoon batteries kept firing. A missile hit a frigate, which exploded its sailors, swallowed by the sea. Another missile landed so close to a destroyer it swept the deck clean of men. The precision was terrifying. Russian radar was still dead. A garbled order to retreat east was mistaken for south, causing 2 ships to nearly collide. Their return fire was wild, uselessly splashing into the ocean. Below the American sub now, stalking the retreat, fired again. A torpedo hit the rudder of a frigate, leaving it dead in the water, drifting helplessly. Distress calls went unanswered. The Russian high command knew that to stay meant total annihilation. A senior officer in Moscow gave the final order: all units disengage, retreat immediately. The command was brief, but it landed like a death sentence. On the sea, the intact ships turned tail. But retreating in a hurricane is its own kind of hell. The damaged ships were left behind, struggling to keep up their crews, begging for a tow. Red emergency lights flashed across the water, a dismal scene in the lightning. Life rafts overloaded with the wounded bobbed, desperately trying to follow the retreating fleet. On the American coast, the defenders watched them go on radar. Some officers wanted to launch more missiles to finish them off, but the high command was firm. Hold positions. Do not pursue into the storm. They knew that to chase them into the open ocean now would be suicide. The advantage was clear. There was no need to pay a higher price. Onshore American soldiers finally collapsed, soaked in sweat and rain. Their armor was heavy, but their eyes were bright with pride. They had held, they had not just survived, they had turned the giant back. An officer watching the last Russian pings fade from the radar whispered, "They're gone. They lost." In the distance, the Russian ships were just smudges of smoke. The long battle was over. The storm still raged, but the guns were silent. The sea was still screaming, but the once mighty fleet had retreated in disgrace. The casualty reports sent to Moscow were kept secret, but the truth was known internally. Multiple warships, including the flagship, were sunk. Hundreds of sailors were missing or dead. This failure wasn't just in numbers, it was in prestige. The fleet that was supposed to dominate had been forced to flee a humiliating image broadcast to the world. The Russian state media ran only a brief statement: the deterrence operation has concluded, all units are returning to base. But the satellite images from international sources were already leaking, burning hulks, massive oil slicks, and life rafts drifting in the waves. The world saw the truth. Russia had failed. In America, loudspeakers broadcast the news. The Russian fleet has withdrawn. A roar went up in the rain. People poured into the streets, many of them crying. It was a day of blood and steel, but in the end they had held their home. As the storm raged on the final radar sweeps, confirmed the Russian fleet was gone. The sea was littered with smoking debris oil and drifting life rafts, the undeniable evidence of a defeat. The internal Russian assessment was brutal. Multiple warships sunk or out of action, including the command vessel, hundreds of sailors lost, a submarine crippled, numerous aircraft gone. Their numerical superiority had been broken by the storm and by America's precise, technologically advanced counterattack. America had also suffered greatly. Launchers were destroyed, naval bases heavily damaged, and hundreds of soldiers had fallen, but the defensive line never broke. They had absorbed the blow and delivered a fatal counterpunch. The result was clear to the world. Russia was forced to retreat in chaos, its naval prestige shattered. America claimed victory, having held its coastline and affirmed its sovereignty. The American president delivered a short, resolute address. The Russian fleet has withdrawn. We have defended our territory, we have defended our freedom. This is a victory for America. The declaration echoed across the globe. The international media dubbed it the Hurricane War, a single engagement that had shifted the political landscape. Analysts noted that American resilience combined with a clear technological edge had made the difference. The invisible hand of that technology wasn't mentioned officially, but its presence was understood. The battle's outcome wasn't just a Russian retreat. It was a devastating blow to the image of absolute power Moscow had tried to build. America, though, battered and scarred, emerged from the storm with its head held high, a symbolic and stunning victory. History had been rewritten, and though the sea still smelled of smoke and oil, the truth was clear.